top story takes us to Europe, where Germany, France and the UK have imposed a social shutdown as countries across the continent try to stem the spread of the coronavirus. Over the past 24 hours, the World Health Organization has registered almost 14,000 confirmed cases and 862 deaths worldwide. This report has the details.
As the COVID-19 pandemic spirals out of control, the European Union has shut itself out to the world for 30 days. Germany has banned religious gatherings, while French President Emmanuel Macron has announced a 15-day lockdown. 100,000 police are being deployed across France to enforce the lockdown.
Violation of these rules is currently punishable by a fine of around 38 euros. It will be raised very quickly to a higher level, which could be 135 euros. Our aim is not to punish, but to call everyone to account.
Prime Minister Boris Johnson has shut down social life in the United Kingdom and ordered the most vulnerable to isolate for 12 weeks. The World Health Organization says the pandemic is the defining global health crisis of the time.
We advise countries to stick to testing, and from there, of course, all the steps that they need to do. And we advise countries to stick to containment strategy, because we believe that this epidemics, this pandemics, or this virus is controllable.
US actor Tom Hanks and his wife Rita Wilson have been released from the hospital in Australia after receiving treatment for coronavirus. Meanwhile, Prime Minister of Monaco, Sergei Tele, and Hollywood star Idris Elba have tested positive for COVID-19.
Well, in the Philippines, the government has placed the entire island of Luzon with 57 million people under an enhanced community quarantine until April 12th. The sudden rise in COVID-19 infections in several Southeast Asian countries has dimmed hopes that warmer weather may slow the spread. Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte says public movement will be restricted to buying food, medicine, and essential items. More African nations also confirmed their first cases of the coronavirus and shut borders. Canada has also closed its borders to all foreign nationals except for U.S. citizens, with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau urging people to stay home.
We will be denying entry to Canada to people who are not Canadian citizens or permanent residents. This measure will carve out some designated exceptions, including for air crews, diplomats, immediate family members of Canadian citizens, and, at this time, U.S. citizens.
Well, Kyrgyzstan has also banned entry to all foreigners to safeguard the country against coronavirus. Now, the humanitarian group Fortify Rights has called on Bangladesh to protect its Rohingya refugee community from the coronavirus. The group warns that conditions in camps like Cox's Bazar leave refugees especially vulnerable to the virus.
Fortify Rights adds that many Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh are already suffering from chronic health issues due to a lack of healthcare facilities. This raises the risk of a high death toll in case of a COVID-19 outbreak. The rights group also urged Dhaka to lift all the restrictions on refugees, preventing them from accessing mobile communications and the internet. It asked the government to halt the construction of fences aimed at confining refugees to their camps. The WHO has warned the novel coronavirus can spread rapidly in conditions where people are living in close proximity to each other, such as refugee camps. The Cox's Bazar refugee camp in southeastern Bangladesh is one of the largest in the world.
Let's now get to some other news. The U.S. says it welcomes the Taliban statement condemning ISIS and committing to stop the militants' attempts to recruit, finance, or train in Afghanistan. This comes after the Taliban announced they have cleared Kunar province from ISIS fighters after an extensive operation. U.S. envoy Zalmay Khalilzad said these actions show the Taliban's seriousness about fulfilling the Doha deal commitments. He said actions against al-Qaeda and other groups that threaten the United States or its allies are part of the agreement. He said Washington's fulfillment of assurances depends on the group's commitment. Khalilzad called the Taliban's recent operations against ISIS terrorists in Kunar positive steps. Meanwhile, Kabul has rejected the prisoner exchange agreed in the Doha deal before intra-Afghan talks. President Ashraf Ghani's administration says the detainees will be released only after the talks begin and the Taliban stop attacking Afghan forces. The former Chief Minister of occupied Kashmir, Farooq Abdullah, has demanded the return of all Kashmiris detained in other parts of India. The Indian government released the former Chief Minister after detaining him for 221 days. Speaking to media, Abdullah said all Kashmiri politicians should be released as soon as possible. He said the families of most of those detained across the occupied valley are facing difficulties in meeting their loved ones. Abdullah said the relatives have to travel to different parts of India and stay inside the vicinity of jails. After August 5th, India arrested over 13,000 Kashmiris, including minors, politicians, and pro-freedom leaders. The occupied valley is reeling with a curfew and clampdown for the past 226 days. Well, India's ruling Bharatiya Janata Party has nominated former Chief Justice Ranjan Gogoi for Parliament's upper house. Gogoi was head of the bench, which gave a controversial verdict of handing the Babri Mosque's land to Hindus in the Ayodhya case. Reacting to that development, the Indian Supreme Court bar called the decision disgusting and a clear reward in quid pro quo. The association said the decision has totally destroyed the semblance of the judiciary's independence. Disgruntled BJP leader Yashwant Sinha said this decision will cause incalculable damage to the judiciary. Aam Aadmi Party leader Raghav Chadha said the move will set a bad precedent for the independence of Indian judiciary. Meanwhile, the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has said Washington will not tolerate attacks on its troops in Iraq. Pompeo said this in a telephone conversation with Iraq's Prime Minister Adil Abdul Mahdi. He told the Iraqi Prime Minister to defend the U.S.-led coalition fighting ISIS in Iraq. He said the U.S. would take additional action as necessary to defend American lives. Pompeo said the groups responsible for these attacks must be held accountable. Last week, 3 American soldiers were wounded in a rocket attack on an Iraqi base in Baghdad. This was the second major attack on U.S. forces in the past week. Palestine says it has submitted its observations to the International Criminal Court on its right to the territories illegally occupied by Israel. The submission is in response to the ICC's request for determining the scope of its territorial jurisdiction in Palestinian areas. The Foreign Ministry says Palestine is the sole sovereign over the territories occupied in 1967. It says the territories are comprised of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. The UN court had launched a preliminary examination into the Palestinian situation after Jerusalem signed its founding treaty in 2015. Tensions in the conflicted zone remain high since U.S. President Donald Trump revealed his Middle East peace plan last month. In Syria, a civilian is killed and 4 others wounded by an explosion in the northeastern province of Al-Hasaka. State media said the explosion was caused by an IED that went off in Shaddadi city. It said one of the wounded civilians is in critical condition. State media said the target of the explosion is unknown, but that the area is controlled by the U.S.-backed Syrian Democratic Forces. In October last year, the Kurdish-led SDF and the government agreed to join forces to establish a border security zone. The UN says fighting in Tripoli and other areas of Libya continues to heavily impact civilians. In a briefing, the global body's spokesperson, Stefan Dujarric, said around 749,000 people remain in areas impacted by fighting in and around Tripoli. Dujarric said almost 345,000 people live in frontline warring areas. He said heavy artillery shelling on the Al-Nawasi base heavily damaged the infrastructure of nearby residential areas. The spokesperson said the UN continues to call on all parties to abide by international humanitarian law to protect civilians. Meanwhile, Libya's daily oil production has dropped from more than 1.2 million barrels to less than 100,000 barrels. The state oil company said tribal leaders in eastern Libya have forced oil fields and ports to shut down in protest against the UN-backed government. Well, Turkey has called on Russia to end its occupation of Crimea. Ankara's call comes on the 6th anniversary of the peninsula's annexation by Moscow. In a statement, the foreign ministry said the international community doesn't recognize Russia's illegal annexation of the Ukrainian territory. It said Moscow's occupation of Crimea was based on an illegitimate referendum. The statement went on to say the well-being and security of Crimean Tatars is a top priority for Turkey. Russia and Ukraine have been at loggerheads since Moscow annexed Crimea in 2014. The UN also views the Kremlin's action in Crimea as illegal. Well, Russia's Constitutional Court has approved amendments that could allow President Vladimir Putin to stay in power until 2036. In its ruling, the top court said Putin's move to amend the constitution to run for president again is in line with Russian law.
Russia's current constitution requires Putin to step down in 2024 when his second sequential presidential term ends. But the amendments would formally reset his presidential term tally to 0, giving him the option of serving 2 additional terms in office. This means Putin could stay in power until 2036. The bill already sailed through the upper house and the regional parliaments as required last week. Putin has been in power for the last 20 years.
And coming up next in this news bulletin, 445 Chileans have suffered eye injuries from pellet guns. And video calling robots are helping elderly during the coronavirus outbreak. Let's begin this segment in Chile, where a student who became famous after being blinded by police during anti-government protests has declared the country's beleaguered president Sebastián Piñera will never regain the trust of the Chilean people. The visually impaired activist says the only way peace can be restored to the country now is if Piñera steps down. More on that now in this report.
Since protests broke out in the country last year, demonstrators in Chile have been tormented by extreme police brutality. 31 people have been killed and 3,000 others wounded. Security forces have allegedly used brutal tactics, including the firing of live rounds, arbitrary arrests, sexual abuse, as well as the firing of dreaded pellet guns which blind protesters. Gustavo Gatica, a student, was blinded after being shot with a pellet gun in the face.
I'm just one more person who, unfortunately, was shot in the face, and I had to be in this situation. But I would like to continue being the person who is going to protest, who demonstrates. No, I don't pretend to be a leader or a representative of this movement.
He says these tactics won't stop Chile's protest movement.
While Piñera remains in office, the violence will continue. I believe his resignation would dial down the tension. I think that is fundamental.
Since last October, 445 Chileans have been rendered sightless by pellet guns. Chile isn't the only place in the world where pellet guns have failed to quell demonstrations and riots. India's ruling BJP has been using the same tactics in occupied Kashmir for years.
Well, Belgian robotics software firm Zorabots will lend a fleet of video calling robots to elderly care homes. This will help residents stay in touch with relatives while they are isolated due to coronavirus precautions. This report has the details.
Belgium's government has banned visitors from elderly care homes to curb the spread of COVID-19, which has infected 158 people in the country and has killed 10. Other measures include limiting shop opening times and closing schools. Zorabots plans to use robots to help ease social isolation amongst the elderly who are more vulnerable to coronavirus.
Our residents miss the contact with the outside world and their families. But of course, there is also a great concern among the family. How is my mummy doing now? How is my daddy doing now? The robot can help us a lot. On one hand, to keep that contact.
It will initially lend 60 James robots, a 1.2 meter tall butler-style bot that usually costs €2,500 to the homes. The robots are fitted with a simplified interface so a care home worker can program them to connect a video call through Facebook Messenger. The firm says it could lend up to 1,000 robots to care homes.
We have the software which is capable of telecommunicating from a distance. We have elders who are not able to communicate with the outside world. Why shouldn't we give our robots out there? We both know that the world is going to stop for a couple of weeks. The stock is going to sit here. We will not be able to sell, so why not use it in a good way?
As part of the scheme, telecoms firm Telling will give a free 4G router to care homes that don't have Wi-Fi.
Oil has slipped below $30 per barrel, plummeting over 11% on average. Globally coordinated crisis measures failed to ease rising fears over the economic fallout of coronavirus. Brent crude plunged to 12% at over $29.50 a barrel. U.S. West Texas Intermediate crude slipped over 9.5% to $28.50 per barrel. North American shale producers have announced they are cutting oil drilling activity and budgets. Brent's premium to WTI narrowed to less than $1, making U.S. crude oil uncompetitive in international markets. This was followed by President Donald Trump's announcement that the U.S. will fill its emergency crude reserves to help domestic energy producers. Leaders of the G7 major economies have pledged to take all necessary measures to safeguard the economy and help workers affected by the coronavirus pandemic. In a joint statement, they said the leaders that they will cooperate to ensure a strong global response and achieve strong growth in the G7 economies. Japan's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe said to ease public fears over the pandemic, the bloc agreed to accelerate work towards developing drugs to treat COVID-19. The leaders called on global institutions like the International Monetary Fund to swiftly deploy financial assistance to countries that need it. Chaired by U.S. President Donald Trump, the meeting is believed to be the first ever G7 summit via video conference. Well, U.S. stock markets have crashed after Wall Street had its worst one-day percentage drop since 1987. The Dow Jones Industrial Average plunged almost 3,000 points, closing about 13% lower, marking its worst one-day point loss ever. The S&P 500 index tanked just shy of 12% for the third time in a week, triggering a 15-minute halt in trading after it fell below 7% in the opening session. Stock sell-offs accelerated into the market close after U.S. President Donald Trump said the economy may be heading into a recession.
Well, it may be. We're not thinking in terms of recession. We're thinking in terms of the virus. Once we stop, I think there's a tremendous pent-up demand, both in terms of the stock market and in terms of the economy. And once this goes away, once it goes through and we're done with it, I think you're going to see a tremendous surge.
Find out what the weather is like around the world. And there you have it. You're all caught up. Of course, for the latest updates on these and other stories, you can always follow us on our social media at Indus.news. Thanks for watching this bulletin.